Hello, and welcome to this week's study on the book of Luke. We're going through the book of Luke and Acts this year, chapter by chapter, just to kind of focus more on the life of Jesus, life of his disciples, and how we can be better as his church. This week is on Luke chapter 12, and we left off last week with Tommy talking about a couple of Pharisees and lawyers coming to question Jesus, and chapter 12 builds off of that. And as he's in that conversation, more people come. It says in the meantime, so many thousands of people had gathered that they're beginning to trample over one another. Like there's an unreasonable number of people are gathering to hear what Jesus has to say. And so he's at the height of his popularity, right? He's at the height of people wanting to see him and all these crowds gathering to hear what he has to say. And so you're probably, if you're one of his disciples, like, okay, say something that's going to keep them, right? Say something good so that they'll stay. But that's not quite what he does. He has one of the biggest crowds and probably some of the hardest teachings that he has. And that's usually the way Jesus rolls a lot of the time. And so we haven't really planned to do this, but we've ended up having kind of a theme that ties each of the chapters. We've kind of picked out a theme that just kind of runs through each of the chapters as we focus on them. We didn't really plan to do that, but it's kind of what has happened. So uh, the theme that I kind of picked out in Luke chapter 12 is that the closer that you get to Jesus, the harder it becomes to cling to the things of this world. It's a little wordy. Tried to shorten it, didn't work, but that's okay. But the closer you get to Jesus, the harder it is to cling to the things of this world. And I think that comes up a lot in this chapter. And it's also important in this chapter to focus on who he's talking to, because he's going to talk to the crowds and he's going to talk to his disciples, which I think is not his entire crowd. It's just a smaller group of people. And so it's important to keep that balance. Notice, okay, who's he speaking to at this point? Because that will be important later. But he starts off talking first to the disciples. So he sees all these people gathering together and he points to them and he's going to say, okay, you need to keep a couple of things in mind before I start teaching. First is to beware of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Don't be like them, okay? But everything that is hidden is about to be revealed, right? Everything you've seen what they're trying to do. It's about to be revealed, right? Everything that's done in secret will be shown. And so he goes on in verse 4, talking about not to have any fear. And he starts off his chapter with that tension, and that's going to go throughout the chapter of the way the Pharisees act and behave, the way the world acts and behaves, and the way they are supposed to act and behave. He says, okay, don't worry about those who can hurt the body, who can even kill the body. That's not who you need to fear. But your fear needs to be directed toward God. You need to fear God. And when you have that lined up the way it's supposed to be, then you actually have nothing to fear. It's actually, I had to read these verses several times. I mean, because you've heard these verses before, but it's just a cool concept, but also kind of one that you need to. I had to sit and think about for a while. Okay, I need to not fear the world around me. Jesus tells his disciples, don't fear those who can harm the body, but fear God. And in that way, you have nothing to fear. And he's going to draw that out a little bit more later in the chapter. But he starts off with these key themes about fear, anxiety, worry, persecution, and the leaven of the Pharisees. And so he goes on in verse 8, talking about those who acknowledge Christ before men. And that kind of ties off to what he was just saying. right? He talks about, okay, you don't need to fear these Pharisees or this world around you. That's going to become really important. Why? Because there is going to be a time when people are going uh, to drag you out and say, okay, who do you really follow? This guy named Jesus, or is he really the one that you want to follow and that you want to put your life in the hands of? And when they do that, it's going to be really important on how you behave in that moment, on what you say and who you commit to in that moment. He says that, but the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels. But the one who acknowledges me before men will also be acknowledged before the angels. And then he goes on and says, don't be anxious about how you should defend yourself in that moment, or what you should say, but fear God and remember that the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. And what's really cool is this gets played out later in Acts. Like, this happens. People are persecuted and drug out for their faith and to Jesus and their following of Jesus. And you have a couple of really cool stories, I mean, sad stories, but encouraging stories of, like, Stephen, who's being about to be stoned to death for his belief, and yet almost uttered similar words as those that Jesus utters on the cross. You just have all these stories showing how people are prevail through those times and are given these things to say at the end of their life to show their commitment to Jesus. And so these little pieces of scripture, especially verses 8 through 12, are going to come into play in a very important way later in Acts, when the church is called to stand up for their faith at times. So he says, remember that. Right? Remember who you're supposed to fear. And then he goes on, and somebody from the crowd comes out and asks him this question about inheritance. Comes and says, tell my brothers to divide the inheritance with me. And how crazy of a question is this, right? He's talking about how they need to be prepared to stay committed to God in the midst of persecution, in the midst of all these things happening around you. And trying to encourage the disciples, and then somebody comes and asks him about his inheritance. Tell my brothers to give me what I want, even if it is rightfully mine or whatever. But Jesus takes this moment to talk a little bit about greed. And so he goes on and telling them a parable about this man who stores up all this stuff for himself, and he almost humorously just sits back and talks to his own soul, talks to his own self, and says, look how much we've stored up, look how much we've gotten for ourselves. I'm going to sit back and be merry, and everything's going to be fine. And Jesus goes on in the parable and says, no, the moment you do that, your life is going to be required of you. Your soul is going to be required of you. And he takes this moment to talk about greed and trying to hold on to the things of this world, right? And this is a topic that obviously comes up a lot in the Bible, of how we handle our treasures, how we think about and live in the midst of the stuff that we have. And this is where I really think this thing comes out a lot, obviously, of if the closer you get to Jesus, the harder it is to cling to the things of this world, right? The harder it is to hold on tightly to the things that we have and the things that we want and the things that we desire. But instead, the closer we get to Jesus, the more we're supposed to let go, the more we're supposed to give up. And so it tells this parable contrasting storing up treasures for yourself versus being rich toward God, right? What does that mean? I think it's cool in Revelation chapter 2, when he's writing to the churches, he writes to one of the churches being persecuted, and he says, I know about your poverty, though you are rich. He says, like, I know that financially things aren't going great for you, you're in the midst of persecution, but man, you are richer than anybody else I'm writing to. because you've fully given in to this cause of living for Christ. And in that way, you've gained far more riches than anybody else could ever gain, because you didn't cling tightly to the things of this world, but feared God and lived for Him. And I think this is a topic that we constantly have to sit and think about and examine in our lives. That's the word I was looking for. Examine in our lives of, okay, what is my heart toward the things that I have? And I think this is why we have contribution every week. And I think it's a great thing that we do have contribution every week, because at the beginning of the week, we have to sit down and ask ourselves, okay, how much can I give, right? We talk about on Sunday mornings about how it's important to give time, and it's important to give these other things, and that is extremely important. But it's also very important that we actually, I think, that we actually give money, right? That we actually take the earnings that we've gotten throughout the week and give it to other people, so that we constantly are softening this heart that can easily become attached and protective of those possessions that we have, right? We can easily become like the man in the parable, where we start building a hedge around all the things that we have and clinging tightly to those possessions. I know that happens to me a lot. We want to hold so tightly to the things that we get and earn, and yet we need to be reminded often, and I think we are reminded every week of the contribution, to remember, hey, this is not what you're storing up for. You're not storing up for the things in this world, but for the things to come, right? That's where your treasure is. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So where has my heart been in those things? And then he turns to his disciples and he says, and this is a big point, as one that I didn't catch the first time I was reading through, and I think I've missed before in the past reading this section, is that he talks about this section on being anxious and anxiety to his disciples in contrast to the people. So he was talking to the people, and this is where it's important to remember who Jesus is talking to in this chapter. He talks to the crowd, talks to this person, and then he turns to his disciples, and he kind of contrasts this other person, this person who stores up for himself, to the way they're supposed to live, as not worrying about the things that we have, the things that we gain, the food that we have, the clothing that we have, not being anxious for those, because God is going to care for you, right? And so he kind of draws out this tension between these two types of people, those who cling to the things of this world and those who cling tightly in fear and trust Jesus and live for Him. And when we do that, and so he even says toward the end, right, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, to give you the things that you need. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Instead of storing up and like the guy in the parable and looking back at all that you've gained in your life, what can you give? Sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide for those, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where thieves approaches and destroy. Where your treasure is, there your heart is also. This is the tension that we're supposed to examine. So I encourage you to go back and read the whole chapter, of course, but especially these two segments, verses 13 through 34, because I think that's one of the core parts of this chapter, is this contrast between this rich guy who comes up to Jesus, and Jesus' disciples and the way he wants them to live. But it goes on, he says, when you live like this with trust and fear of God, then these are the people who are going to be ready, right? They're the ones who are going to be ready at Christ's return. and waiting eagerly to be reunited with Him. And that's where our hope and longing is for God, not for the things that exist in this world. And then he goes on with a couple of other teachings about interpreting the times. He even gives a section of it has a title in my Bible of not peace but division, where it talks about, I haven't come just to make everything cool in your life, but to make a divide between people, to make you to realize that this is not what we're living for, right? But we're living for something greater, something else. And so I think again, the core of this chapter is getting back to this idea of closer we get to Jesus, the harder it becomes to cling to the things of this world. And of course, that doesn't mean that having things is bad. Of course, not gaining things or money is bad, or that buying clothes, buying food that we want is bad. Of course, Maddie and I are about to have a little girl. You best believe that we're going to go buy that girl so many clothes that she's not going to have enough room, or probably not even going to wear them all, because we love her and want to give her everything already. And she's not even here yet. But I think it all goes back to the heart of the issue. Okay, where has my heart been when it comes to possessions and money and wealth? Do I have a tendency to build up and hedge and cling to the things that I have, or do I have a heart that mirrors Christ and tries to give to those around me, give to those who need it, so that one, I can soften my heart in that way, and two, help lead others to Christ. And I think the more we do that, the more we become the church that He wants us to be. And if every preacher says this, and sometimes I mean it, maybe sometimes I don't, but I promise you this lesson strikes me as well as saying, okay, Blake, how much do you truly cling and cherish the things that you have? And so that's a question I'm going to have to go back and think about a lot, and I hope maybe that you'll be able to take some time to think about as well, and hopefully we'll be able to encourage and uplift one another in that way, and that we'll be able to be there for one another as we grow in that aspect. But that's Luke chapter 12. Next week will be Luke chapter 13. And thank you for hopping on. Hope you can join us again next week. Bye.